darkness falls, so cold is your shell. The demon calls to lure you to hell. In brittle air with brittle bones, ghostly winds cover brittle moans. The night will fall, the ghouls will rise. The moon shone its light on your clever disguise. October's devils, they knock for you, but the monsters can't get you if the monster is you. Good evening, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. In tonight's tale, we follow a young man on a journey to visit his grandmother. Let's hope there are no big bad wolves to get in the way of his travels. It probably isn't going to help that he just so happens to be making this trip during Ghost Month, in which the gates of hell have been opened to allow the spirits to roam the earth. But let us not get too carried away with such legend. Without further ado, we present The Night is Following Us. When I was a child growing up in California, my grandmother lived with me and my parents. My family's originally from Asia, but I was born in the US. Something that I remember vividly about growing up with my grandmother was seeing and hearing her pray every night. Sometimes she would sit in one place and pray by candlelight. Other times, she would walk around the house while doing it. And during certain times of the year, she followed rituals that I assume were related to her religion. This was my daily life as far back as I can remember, all the way up until I was 16 years old. That's when my grandmother decided to move back to her homeland. I was never quite sure of why she left, but I think that perhaps she was living with my family to help raise me, and once she thought I was old enough, she decided that her job was done, and it was now time for her to return home. About a year after my grandmother went home, I spoke to her about coming to visit. She said it might be better if I waited for another month or so. But I told her that I missed her and I didn't want to wait. She relented, but told me that if I wanted to visit her, I had to agree to listen to everything she told me and adhere strictly to her rules. I agreed, having no idea what could be so dire. My parents booked my ticket for a flight that was just 1 week out. When the day of my trip finally arrived, my parents dropped me off at the airport about 2 hours prior to departure. They helped me get my luggage out of the car and hand it off to the bag check agents outside. After that, an agent gave me my boarding pass, and I said goodbye to my parents before going inside. After going through security with my one carry-on, a backpack with my computer and a few small things in it, I ventured down the hallway toward my gate. I watched the gate numbers get higher as I passed each one. After checking my phone, I realized that I still had over an hour until takeoff. So I decided to stop at one of the shops and get something to drink. I wasted a few minutes looking at California tourist shirts, travel magazines, and souvenir trinkets in the shape of California and bears. I grabbed a bottle of water, and after paying a small fortune for it, headed over to my gate to sit and wait for my boarding call. While I was waiting and playing on my phone, I remembered to reach into my backpack and grab the beaded bracelet that my grandmother had given me before she left California. I put it on to make sure I didn't forget to do so before I arrive. I didn't want her to catch me not wearing it. I was excited by the idea of flying for the first time. I was scared, but I reminded myself of what I read, that there were anywhere from 50,000 to 150,000 commercial flights every single day, and we rarely hear about one of them crashing. But a thought occurred to me. We're going to be flying over the ocean. If an airliner disappears over the ocean, never to be found, is that counted as a crash? I had to remember to look that up later. Finally, boarding was called. I ended up getting in shortly after first class seating finished. As I walked by those beautiful first class chairs, I couldn't wait to see where I was sitting. And then I reached my row in coach. The seats were much smaller and uglier. Why didn't my parents get me the good seats? Whatever. I sat down and put my earpods in. After everyone else got in and sat down, I realized my luck, as I was the only one in my row. I guess the seat that my parents reserved wasn't so bad after all. There was a flight attendant standing in the aisleway, looking for everyone's attention, so I took my earpods out and stared in her direction. Once she saw that she had our gaze, she showed us where the emergency exits are and what to do in case of cabin depressurization. I only half paid attention. My flight lifted off around 9 p.m. when the night was already setting in. Liftoff was a jarring experience. It began with the plane moving slowly on the ground as if on some aimless Sunday drive. After maybe 10 minutes of this, the plane came to a complete stop. The individual overhead air vents suddenly roared to life. The sound of the idling engines kicked into high gear, and we started moving again. Except now, our speed picked up like we were on a racetrack. The plane lifted off, and soon after, there was the deafening sound of my ears popping. I felt like I was falling upward at an ever-increasing speed. And just then, I remembered that my grandmother had suggested that I chew gum during takeoff to prevent my ears from popping. Oops. Once we achieved our desired altitude, the plane seemed to level out. I no longer felt like I was facing the sky with a freight train pushing me from behind. Eventually, I saw the flight crew walking freely around the cabin. I decided to just try to go to sleep, as I knew I had a very long flight ahead of me. 14 hours. But first, I took a look out my window. All I saw were tiny lights. It was already quite dark out. I leaned back in my seat, put in my earbuds, and closed my eyes. Good evening and welcome to the Phantasmagorium, began the Creepypasta narration in my ears. I drifted off while listening to a story about ghosts over the water. I felt more uneasy when I realized that while listening to this, I, in fact, was thousands of feet above an ocean, soon to be thousands of miles from land. What happens if there is an emergency? No place to land, no one to call. I drifted off. I awoke to the sound of flight attendants taking dinner orders a few rows ahead of me. The lights were dim in the cabin, but the aisleways were lit sufficiently for the crew to do their jobs. I peered out the window to see the same scene as before, except for the tiny ground lights. We were now over the ocean, far from land, enveloped in the night. When the attendant reached me, I gave her my order, and then leaned back to close my eyes again. I was sure that she would wake me up when she returned. The next thing I remember was waking suddenly to the sound of someone whispering directly into my ear. Awake. My eyes popped wide open, and something was different. The roar of the airplane was no longer there. The sound I heard now was of near complete silence. I could, however, feel that we were still in the air, flying, We weren't falling, just flying, without a sound from the engines. I could hear the wind from the outside as our aircraft tore a hole through the sky. Were we traveling even faster than before? The silence wasn't the only difference. The cabin lights were no longer only dim. They were completely out, including the aisleway. I could only see the faintest of light coming from the few windows that hadn't had their shades pulled down. I turned to look out of my window. The only source of light was from the moon. It wasn't quite full, but close. The other seats in my row were still empty, so I'm not sure where that whisper in my ear came from. Had I dreamt it? I sat still, wondering what was happening. None of the other passengers were making a sound. From what little I could see, the backs of their heads still seemed to be in their seats. How long was this darkness going to last? What was happening? Then it dawned on me. I knew what to do. I remembered that before we took off, the flight attendant told us that we could hit the little button above our heads if we needed anything. I reached up in search of buttons, and though I could barely see them, I hit each one that I could find. They didn't light up, and they didn't make a sound. I couldn't tell if I had actually done anything, so I waited. Sometime later, I began to hear static, as if someone had turned on the announcement speakers and they were about to say something. I assumed the pilots or the flight crew were going to make some statement. Surely this was going to be where they told us that everything was going to be fixed and back to normal soon. The static seemed to stay there for quite some time without anybody speaking. Instead, it grew steadily louder. After several minutes, something else was added to the sound. A quiet, slow, whispering voice started to surface from within the static. It was loud enough to hear, but the static around it was so loud that it was impossible to tell what it was saying. It was a slow, droning whisper that didn't improve my situation at all. And just like that, the static and whispering came to a sudden halt. They were broken by the welcome sound of a flight attendant's voice. "Here you go, sir," she said as she was handing me a tray. The lights were back to normal. The sounds of the airplane were back. I could hear the engines again. "Is there something we can help you with?" added the flight attendant. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You pressed the help button above your seat," she replied. "Oh, yeah, I guess I did." It was true. I tried to press the button when the plane was dark, but couldn't seem to find it as nothing lit up. I guess it must have worked, though. "Was there something going on a minute ago? It was really dark in here, and there was some static coming through the speaker. There was like a whispering sound, like somebody was trying to say something." She looked at me, puzzled. "I don't think so. I didn't hear or see that. But I was in the galley, so maybe I missed it. I'll check with the crew and see if anybody noticed anything. Thank you," I said with a half smile as she pushed the cart to the next row of passengers. Was I asleep? I couldn't have been. I pushed the help button when it was dark, and the attendant just confirmed with me that it had been pushed. If that was a dream, it wouldn't have been pushed in real life. I looked down and realized that my earpods were now in my lap. I decided to dig into my meal. I had chicken, rice, some sort of mixed vegetables. It wasn't the greatest thing I'd ever eaten, but I didn't expect much from prepackaged airline food. After finishing, I looked through my Creepypasta narrations to see what I had with me. I pulled a bunch of them down ahead of time because I was told that the airplane Wi-Fi wouldn't be able to handle streaming audio. Then, I put them in a playlist so that I wouldn't have to keep looking through them. Yet, here I was, looking through them. I put my earpods back in and continued listening. It's time to sit back with your favorite drink and listen. I looked out my window to see that the almost full moon was still there, and the ground was still dark, as it was still the ocean. I stopped another flight attendant as they walked by. "Excuse me, miss. How much longer until we arrive?" "We're about 2 hours in, so we still have 12 hours left," she said. "Do you know when it'll be getting light out?" I asked. "Actually, it won't be getting light outside during the flight. We're heading west, the same direction as the sun. The night is following us." "Oh," I replied. She smiled and moved on. The night is following us. If that isn't menacing, I don't know what is. I settled back in and closed my eyes. I was listening to a story about werewolves, which made me think of my grandmother. I was looking forward to seeing her for the first time in more than a year. Good thing I wasn't wearing my little red hoodie. Knowing my grandmother, she'd be the one eating the wolf. She was the alpha of the house growing up, and my parents seemed to know that. Wake up. My eyes were suddenly open. I was wide awake. The silence had returned. Nothing but the sound of this giant speeding bullet that I was sitting in, slicing through the night air above the world. The darkness had also returned. Outside of my window, dark, except for the moon. Inside the cabin, a few rays of moonlight allowed me to see that I was still inside of the aircraft. A sound of clinking glass came from the front of the plane. It slowly grew louder with each movement. A bit of clanking, and then silence. In a repeating pattern, over and over. Eventually, it got close enough that I could start to see something in the slivers of moonlight that invaded the darkness. It was a dark shape, but it seemed to be a human shape, with something in front of it. Like it was pushing something. It seemed to move in slow motion. I sat in frantic silence, watching it move down the aisle in my direction. It traveled one row at a time, pausing for a bit, then moving on to the next. I then noticed that there was more than one. A second figure followed. Each time the figures stopped, they would turn toward rows on opposite sides. And then the whispering began. They weren't talking. They were whispering. A very slow, drawn-out whisper that matched the speed of their movement. I dared not make a sound or any sudden movements to draw the attention of these figures. But I knew that they would eventually reach me. When they reached the point of just 3 rows in front of me, I noticed something new. After the whispering, something would follow. It was almost like the whispering would reverse itself back into the figure. But I could see it. It looked a bit like cold winter breath. Something was visibly being sucked away from the row into the dark figure, followed by the backs of the passengers' heads laying back silently into their seats. I realized I was now sweating, waiting for the inevitable. I guess I must have been breathing too loudly, because suddenly, both figures stopped what they were doing and turned slowly toward me. And then, stood motionless, aiming what I assumed were their eyes directly at me. I sat frozen, trying to keep my breaths as shallow as possible, thinking that maybe these things worked off of sound or movement. After they stared at me in silence for way too long to be comfortable, they began their slow motion movements again. But this time, they didn't stop. They were coming straight toward me, keeping their eyes on me the entire time. Then, they did stop, right in front of me. The one in front leaned in slowly, getting closer and closer. The whispering began. With its face directly in front of me, it started pulling something out of me as it had the others. I couldn't breathe. I was getting lightheaded. Suddenly, a flight attendant was in front of me, asking if I wanted something to drink. I was hyperventilating, staring at her to the side. The lights were back on, and so were the sounds. "Are you okay?" she asked. I held one hand up, as if to say, "Just a minute," while I caught my breath. I don't know. Was I asleep just now? "I don't think so," she said. "You looked like your eyes were wide open as I was coming down the aisle. Can I get you something to drink?" "Okay. Yeah. Can I have some water, please?" She poured water into a plastic cup for me. I checked my phone. 5 hours down. 9 more hours to go. 9 more hours in the airplane. 9 more hours over the ocean. 9 more hours of night. 9 more hours of darkness. Have you ever woken up from a nightmare and decided to keep yourself awake for a while in order to avoid falling right back into that nightmare? That's what I was trying to do. Whether it was a dream, or some alternate reality, or even just pure reality, I did not want to go back there. My playlist moved on to a new story. Something about the dance macabre and Halloween. On my 16th birthday, my grandmother pulled me to the side and said that she had something to tell me in private. We walked outside into the backyard, shutting the sliding door behind us. She told me to take a seat at the table by the pool. I did, and she sat as well. She lit up a cigarette, taking a few puffs off of it. We both sat in silence for probably 30 seconds while she smoked and looked at me. She then said, "John, I'm not going to be here forever, but I need to know that you're ready before I go." "What do you mean, Lola? Are you okay?" "Yes, Apo. Don't worry. I'm fine. But it's time for me to go home. Before I go, I have a special birthday gift for you." Using her right hand, she reached over and pulled a beaded bracelet off of her other wrist. She then took my arm and slid the bracelet over my hand. The black and gray beads looked pretty cool. She continued, "Keep this on whenever Lola is not around to protect you." I looked at her, confused. She just stared at me with a "you listen to me" look on her face. "Okay, Lola," I said. I decided to try to use the airplane's Wi-Fi to connect to the outside world and try to assure myself that I was still part of it. The connection was extremely slow, but I'd take whatever I could get. I avoided Reddit because I wanted to stay away from anything that might cause nightmares right now. Instead, I looked up info on where I was going, the Philippines. According to a website I found, local traditions say they're celebrating something called Ghost Month right now, and that there were rules that you had to follow in order to not be taken by ghosts. Normally, I'd say I don't believe in that type of thing, but after what had been happening to me on this flight, I wasn't so sure. John. I didn't even get to take a drink of my water before, without warning, I was sucked right back into the darkness, as if I was pulled by something. A split second before, I heard a loud suction sound, and then the lights and sound were gone, once again. To my relief, the dark figures were no longer there. Although I guess I shouldn't have counted those chickens so early. After a long wait and deafening silence, save for the sound of wind outside of the cabin, the speaker static returned. And then, so did the whispering. This time, I tried listening intently to the whisper to try and make out what it was saying. Eventually, there was also a new sound coming from the front of the plane. It was different than last time. Instead of clanking glass, it was a dragging sound. Something very heavy and metallic, dragging slowly down the aisle, pausing in between each drag. I began to detect a faint smell of seawater, like when you're on a boat or near the ocean. A very different figure started to emerge from the darkness. This one was not exactly human-shaped like the other ones. It was much taller and appeared to be hunched over, like a deformed giant of some sort. Its head almost touched the ceiling, even in its hunched-over stance. There was nothing in front of this one. Perhaps the dragging sound was coming from behind him. I tried to hunch down behind the seats in front of me so it wouldn't find me, but I knew this wouldn't do any good. As it drew nearer, another sound became apparent. The sound of dripping, and the sound of flesh against a wet floor. I tried to pretend I was asleep as the rest of the passengers appeared to be, hoping that he'd walk on by if I looked to be unconscious. I kept one eye cracked slightly open, trying to monitor what was happening. The dragging had now become excruciatingly loud, and I could finally see what was dragging. There was a chain wrapped multiple times around the figure, attached to a large metal sea anchor dragging behind him. Whatever was dripping, it was coming off of him, leaving a trail down the aisle. I must have opened my eye too wide, because just then, having almost moved past my aisle, he stopped moving and slowly turned back in my direction. I was sure he must have been looking directly at me, although I couldn't see well enough to actually see eyes on him. My nightmare began to come true as he turned and started moving into my row at his slow motion pace, right toward me. He didn't even have to walk. He just moved his head and arms in my direction. I couldn't handle it anymore. I threw my arms up over my face and began screaming, "No! Stop! Help! Somebody help me! Turn on the lights!" What was that sound? I looked up. The fastened seatbelt's light had turned on. A split second later, the aisle lights were back on as well. And so were the sounds of the airplane. The giant seawater creature was gone. I looked down at my phone to see that we were only an hour away from landing in Manila. And it is still completely dark outside, save for the moon. 13 hours in the dark, still another hour to go. It'll be 11 p.m. in their time zone when we do land. That means another full night of darkness on top of the 14 hours of night on the plane. Oh God, I hope this isn't some new way that vampires have found to live without sunlight. We should be landing in just under 1 hour. We've certainly enjoyed flying with you, and we wish you a wonderful time at your final destination, wherever that may be. And if you'll be staying in the Philippines, be sure to observe the rules for Ghost Month, said the announcer over the speaker. I hope this gets better when I get to my grandmother's house. I sure hope things do get better when John gets to his grandmother's house. Until next time, sweet nightmares. Good evening, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Tonight is the 1st of October, the Harvest Moon. What exactly is the Harvest Moon? Well, as our friend here is about to find out, it's not exactly what the internet would lead you to believe. For your pleasure, and perhaps a bit for your safety, we now present Harvest Moon. Every last full moon before the autumn equinox, that is, when day and night both occupy almost exactly the same length of time, people around here start to get jittery. And they have good reason to. This day brings with it not only an end to the warm days and nights of summer, but with it comes the cold sting of impending death. We call it the Harvest Moon. On the night of the Harvest Moon, your responsibilities are clear. 1. Be sure you have all of your gathering and chores done before nightfall. 2. Make sure all of the animals are put away, except for one of each. Leave them in the field. 3. As of nightfall, lock your doors and turn out the lights until morning. Cover your windows if possible.
4.
Whatever you do, do not go outside after dark. Legend only reports that the harvest moon was used to provide farmers with light to help us with our nighttime crop gathering. But most of what you read hides the dark side of the harvest moon. Nobody wants to acknowledge that it exists. They'd rather bury the truth than be burdened with reality. And nobody knows this truth better than I do. When I was 9 years old, the kids at school used to taunt each other with the oncoming harvest moon. They'd tease you and tell you that it was coming for you, that it was going to eat you. Some of the bolder kids would also make claims to have seen a creature who comes to take the children away on the night of the harvest moon. The official name of the creature? The Lord of the Harvest. This is how the adults knew him. The kids decided on a much cuter nickname. They called him Harvey. They would chant,
"His arms and legs are long like trees. He'll hang your skin so it flaps in the breeze. Whosoever Harvey finds, he'll wrap your guts on trees like vines. Try to run, try to hide. Harvey will get you if you don't stay inside. Autumn night, harvest moon. Everywhere that you can hide, Harvey can hide too."
My father once told me, "You never go outside on the night of the harvest moon. No good can come from it. It brings nothing but death." This particular year, some kids dared us to meet them after dark to try and get a look at Harvey. Probably 12 of them said they were going to be there. I told them my dad wouldn't let us outside on the night of the harvest moon. Of course, they teased me relentlessly, saying I was scared like a little baby. I finally relented and told them I'd do it. I agreed to meet with them after 10 p.m. to make sure my dad was already asleep. My little brother and sister both wanted to come with me, but I told them that this was for big kids only and they had to stay home. I promised I'd tell them all about it afterward, as long as they didn't tell Dad. I showed up to meet those kids in the schoolyard a few minutes after 10, and saw that only 3 other kids actually showed up. Boy, those other ones were sure gonna get laughed at for being scaredy cats the next day at school. The one kid, Tommy, who was known as a bully, asked me,
"You sure you want to do this, kid? You look kind of skinny and pale. I'm not sure you're gonna make it,"
he said with a sarcastic grin. All 3 of them launched into another chant directed at me.
"Harvey's gonna get you. Take your skin and eyeballs too. Harvest moon is out tonight. Everybody's gonna die." "Don't worry, I'm fine,"
I said. They all laughed at me.
"Sure, okay,"
said one.
"We'll see."
We walked to Old Man Witherby's farm, about a half-mile from where I lived. It's been said that many people have spotted the creature there. After waiting for almost an hour, we were getting tired and started making rumblings about going home. It was just after that Tommy stopped cold. "Shh," he said to us in a loud whisper. The next several minutes were a blur. Right after Tommy whispered to us, something grabbed him and pulled him away so fast that we didn't even see it. It was just 2 long arms snatching him out of the darkness. The rest of us started screaming and got up to run.
This way,"
one of them yelled. We followed. As we ran toward the barn, another one of the kids, Josh, was snatched up from right next to me. I looked over my shoulder, and all I could see was a large, tree-like figure. Must have been at least 12 feet tall. I screamed, and then reversed course and started running off in another direction, toward where I live. The creature must have kept following the last kid, Jimmy, toward the barn. I heard one last scream as I was running home. The next day, Jimmy wasn't at school. By the end of the day, we were told that Tommy, Josh, and Jimmy were all missing. And later, at home, I was told that entrails were found all over Witherby's farm. Police were trying to identify who they belonged to. I didn't tell anybody what happened, not even my brother and sister, who I promised to tell before going out. I just told them,
I can't.
I might finally tell them tonight. Today, I have kids of my own. I inherited the farm when my dad passed away. I will not be allowing my kids outside tonight. I'm currently boarding up the windows and putting digital lock codes on the doors and not telling them the code. Until tomorrow at least. You see, the word harvest in the phrase harvest moon does not refer to the harvesting of crops, as the modern whitewashed explanations tell you. The word harvest refers to humans. Remember, kids, stay in tonight. Don't go out trying to impress your friends by looking for Harvey. Until next time, sweet nightmares. Good evening, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Here, we have all varieties of treats for you to experience, and maybe a few tricks. It is sometimes said that we live in a simulation. My question for you is, how will we know when the simulation becomes real? This next tale will begin to blur that line for you. We now present my Halloween virtual reality experience. This happened a couple of years ago when I was 18. I had just finished high school and was only working part-time, so I had tons of free time, and most of it was spent with my girlfriend. When Halloween came, we made plans to attend a friend's party, but that fell apart in a big way. Long story. So, we decided to have some fun and seek out some haunted houses. We live in one of the biggest cities in the Midwest, so there was a lot to choose from. Most of the places we visited were pretty cheesy. Some guy in a bed sheet jumping out and yelling boo, the occasional plastic spider, you know the stuff. But then, we came to one that was really something else. It was a fairly small booth, set up down a busy pedestrian street, and was marketing some sort of tech company. Virtuous something, maybe? I don't know. I had never heard of it before, and I didn't really bother trying to remember it. Besides, it wasn't the company that was supposed to draw your attention. It was the sign, which read, "Experience pure horror in VR." Now, I always thought VR was cool, but being a broke teenager, I never actually had the chance to use it, so I was pretty excited. My girlfriend felt differently. Normally, she was a huge horror junkie, but this time, She seemed spooked. I asked her what was up, and she said that it just felt off to her. I shrugged my shoulders and told her to wait for me to come back, then stepped into the booth. Inside of the booth, an admittedly quite attractive lady directed me to a chair and placed a VR headset on me. She asked me if I was ready. When I said yes, the screen turned on, and I immediately found myself in the most immersive virtual world I had ever been in. The graphics were amazing, not quite photorealistic, but the total immersion of VR made that irrelevant. I felt like I was really in that world. Within the simulation, I was strapped to a rail car. There was no real way to move, but I could rotate my head and look around me. As the rail car started, I was brought through an amusement park-esque haunted house experience. At first, it was really tame, and thus, kinda lame. Lots of ghosts and vampires and other basic stuff, though the sheer immersion did make it a bit more interesting than a regular haunted house. Now, the whole experience was mostly like that. Generic Halloween monsters and jump scares. But what really sold the experience was the narration. The narrator had a soft but confident voice. It really reminded me of a college professor. In fact, what he was talking about was kind of like a lecture, as he kept going on and on about the inevitability of death, man's irrelevance to nature, and how God didn't exist. As the ride went on, and the voice kept talking in my ear, I found myself getting more and more scared. Not at any one thing, but just the way that the narrator would distract me just enough for the monsters to take me by surprise. And then, when I was used to the monsters, the narrator would come back into focus and remind me of the emptiness of existence. As the narration went on, things started to get more personal. He started to shift focus away from God and nihilism and onto my family and loved ones. He started asking me if I loved my girlfriend more for her personality or for her body. He asked me if I thought my parents were happy that I was born. As he was saying these things, the monsters jumping out started to change. Instead of zombies and vampires, it was my father, covered in blood. My mom, with her wrists slit. And my girlfriend, with half of her face blown off. At one point, the monster that jumped out was me, at the age of 14. He was holding a gun, and the narrator asked me if I was truly happy that I hadn't killed myself. I don't even know how he could have known about that. Eventually, the ride came to an end. The rail car stopped, and a hooded man appeared. He spoke to me, and I realized that he was the narrator. He said that though my journey was at an end, he was going to leave me with something that would make me remember it for the rest of my life. Then, he pulled out a knife and ran it across my forehead. The screen went black, and the headset was lifted off of me by the attractive assistant. I thanked her and walked outside to meet my girlfriend. I told her all about the experience and how immersive it was. What she had to say once I was done will stick with me forever. She pointed at my forehead and said, "How did you get that cut?" How far does virtuality blur before it becomes reality? Until next time, sweet nightmares. Good evening, my October ghouls, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. We've all seen those houses that don't seem to put up much in the way of Halloween decorations, or even turn on their porch lights to signify they're open for trick-or-treaters. But, have you ever wondered why? For our next tale, I present to you, our town doesn't celebrate Halloween here. We hide from it.
Peter, grab the locks from the garage. And hurry, we only have 2 hours left.
I came back to Earth rather quickly and hustled toward the garage. That's when I heard a loud gunshot a few blocks away. I walked down the steps and flipped the light switch on in the garage. While I reached out for the locks, that's when it hit me. Tonight was Hallows' Eve. You see, our town every year has a tradition. I'd call it more a curse, but that's beside the point. Every single year on Halloween, something enters our town and takes 6 children for every 6 blocks. 3 boys, 3 girls. There's no way to stop the curse except to avoid it at all costs. Lock your doors, board up your windows because this thing isn't human. That's all we know, simply because we've never had anyone who lives to tell us the tale of what truly is out there. I noticed these strange things happening around Halloween when I was 12 years young. I was laying down, trying to fall asleep. Couldn't have been more than an hour until I heard the yelling coming from my parents. While I was sitting in my bed trying to make out what they were arguing about, my dog creaked open the door. I saw my dog walk down the steps, and suddenly, their voices became clear. I heard my mother say,
Michael, we can't be here tomorrow. It's happening. Don't you remember?
My dad retorted,
Of course I do, Linda. You don't think I'd send him to Jim's? Obviously I would, but no. Someone had to book a last-minute vacation and never thought to tell a damn soul. Not even their goddamn brother.
Jim? Uncle Jim. He was talking about how every year I go to my cousin's for Halloween. My mother responded calmingly,
It's going to be okay, Michael. There's always a solution. Peter and I will go down to the storm shelter tomorrow night. You'll stay up here and watch over the house. He'll be inside. There's no need to worry.
I started to slowly inch my way toward the stairs when I heard a knock on the door. Father spoke loudly. Who is it? He started to walk toward the door when another 3 knocks banged loudly against my door. I heard a man speak behind the front door.
Deputy Sheriff's Department, anyone home?
As I glanced around the wall, I saw a tall man with a shiny badge standing at the door. He spoke.
How's it going tonight? I'm just stopping by to make sure y'all stay inside tomorrow night because you know how things go around here. We don't want you going anywhere, so feel free to call the station if you have any questions or require any assistance tomorrow night. Anywho, have a good night now.
He shot a look over toward me before stepping off our front porch, which didn't help much, considering my nerves and anxiety were going through the roof currently. Dad closed the front door after wishing the officer a safe night. Tomorrow would be my very first Halloween in this little town since Kyle and Garrett are in the Bahamas. Like I mentioned earlier, I spend Halloween with my cousins every year, who only live a few hours south from here. I love when I would go there because they lived in a full candy bar type neighborhood. You know the type. Rich yuppies every so often, many mansions, and sports cars around every turn. Also, my cousins are more akin to siblings to me since I'm an only child. I would rather go over there any time of the day than sit 5 more minutes in this creepy old town. The reason I am documenting my experience here is for no other purpose than a warning. Don't try to search for this wicked town. Your intentions may be good, but all you'll walk out of this place with is more suffering than you thought was human. I mean it too. You'll feel it as soon as you pass by that damn welcome sign. It sneaks up on you like a cobra in the forest. You feel it crawl up your body and sink into your chest. The best way I can describe it is if you've been running down a dark tunnel for miles, but you haven't moved an inch. Mark my words when I tell you this. For anyone out there that wants to visit this wicked town, don't. That very night, my dad took his keys off the kitchen counter and hurried out the front door to go somewhere urgently. I woke up to a bunch of commotion downstairs. It sounded like a hammer banging up against a wall. Yawning, I rubbed my eyes and stretched my arms up. I got up and went over to my parents' room to see my mother getting ready for the day. I looked at her and asked, "What's Dad doing downstairs?" She replied with, "Oh honey, he's just doing some work on the house for tonight, that's all." She patted my shoulder, reassuring me. Halloween is tonight. What work needs to be completed for Halloween? Decorating? I walked downstairs to look beyond the wall and I saw my dad boarding up the front door. I was certainly confused on what he was doing, because what type of work for Halloween requires boards of wood shutting the front door off from the outside? I quickly acknowledge this and yell over the banging. "Hey Dad, why are you locking us out?" Thinking to myself I was confused. How would I be able to leave tonight to go trick-or-treating? After a moment, he replied with, "Not out, in. I'm sure your little mind is very confused because your mother and I haven't explained what's wrong with this town to you yet." I didn't even know what all this meant, only being 12. I just wanted to go out and trick-or-treat. Last year was so fun, and now my parents are taking it away from me. All I want is some candy, and for some strange reason, my dad is boarding up our house. I asked, "What do you mean, wrong? What's wrong with this town?" My father must have smelled the concern dripping off of me, like a towel after being submerged in water. What was he locking us in from? He paused for a moment. "Let me explain. Every Halloween, something evil comes out in this town. It hides in the shadows within these streets and will wait to prey on 6 children for every 6 blocks until it reaches the end of our town. Last year, they counted 18 missing. Nobody knew what was taking the children because no one has ever set eyes on it and lived on till the next morning to inform us. As the sunlight turns pale on All Hallows Eve, remember this: you are never alone." My 12-year-old brain could only compensate for so much. One thing stood out to me, though. There were only 3 hours till sunset. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that my father was locking us inside with plywood boards all over our windows and doors now. What is it with this strange town? I'd never really believed in monsters as a child, but now my parents believe something quite equal to that is out there. There's no way to get around this curse our town has. It's possessed with something that is far from human. I wanted to see what everyone was so scared of. I wanted to see this monster. It was almost 4 at this point, and my mother made Father and me our favorite meal, a pastrami sandwich. I was parched after devouring my lunch, and my mother's famous iced tea suited the purpose. I was merely 2 sips away from finishing my drink when my father yelled from the other room. "Peter, grab the locks from the garage, and hurry, we only have 2 hours left." As the sun drifted away into darkness, the night crept upon the horizon, welcoming the evil end. My dad locked up the garage door and bolted 6 plywood boards upon the door into the house from the garage. He went to talk to my mother about something I'm not quite sure of. I then heard my mother say, "Peter, honey, let's go downstairs now. Your father's going to stay up here for the night to make sure nothing happens to us. I'll cook us a meal for later while you get your things ready for the night." I walked up the stairs to see my dog laying on the top. I told him to come into my room and closed my door. Looking out the window, I saw the sun setting. There was a purple-blue sky just over the sun's blissful orange corona. I stood there with my dog looking up at me for a few minutes, just admiring the sunset. I wasn't worried about tonight, nor frightful. No, quite the opposite. I felt this overwhelming sense of curiosity of what was upon that horizon. It almost felt as if something was pulling me toward whatever it was. It started happening just moments after I saw the green bursts of light you see after the sun sets. This feeling inside of me gifted me with courageous moments of inquisitiveness. Something was boiling up in my head to go outside, and I just had to. Something sparked in my head. The key. I knew where the spare key was for the side door. If I could get that, I would be able to leave the house. The only problem is, my father will notice if I leave. I grabbed a sleeping bag and a few pillows downstairs. I dragged the sleeping bag all the way down to the basement, while fighting with my dog Max, since he keeps biting the back of the sleeping bag. I walked past the kitchen, getting a whiff of the amazing chicken pot pie my mother had just cooked. I haven't had much thought on how I would get out tonight, but I did know how to get that key. It was on top of the refrigerator, so I climbed on top of the countertop next to the fridge. Feeling around the top of the refrigerator, I grabbed a few dust bunnies and the key. It was now dark out, and I heard my mother calling me. "Peter, it's time. I have your meal down here. We need to shelter in place." I heard my father walking down the stairs and shoved the key in my pocket. I was always a pretty good liar, so when he abruptly asked what I was doing, I said, "Getting some water for us." I reached out toward the kitchen sink to turn it on. He replied with, "All right now, after that, get on down there with your mother." I smiled and took 2 glasses of water down to the basement where I was met with my dog Max and mother. I handed her a glass of water and said, "I'm pretty hungry after smelling those remnants in the kitchen you left." She laughed and said, "I set up a table for us over there." She pointed toward the other side of the basement. I saw a candle with a dimly lit flame on top of an old wooden table. It was passed down by my great-grandmother. That table was an antique. I always remember my mother saying not to touch it because I would get my fingerprints on it. I was shocked she was letting me eat dinner on it. I gave her a hug and sat down. Over this meal, I ever so slightly kept feeling that urge in the back of my mind. I kept envisioning what was outside on this cold night. I finished up my meal by dropping some leftovers to Max. It was probably a few hours into the night at this point, and now that inquisitiveness I felt earlier was dwelling inside of me. It was like the anticipation a child has to wake their parents up on Christmas morning. I told myself that this feeling must be acted on. I wanted to be rebellious and be the first to figure out what this creature was. I developed a plan in my head. I asked my mother, "Hey Mom, I need to go to the bathroom. Can I go upstairs?" She glanced over toward me and debated for a minute. "Yes, please hurry though," gesturing for me to go. I got up from my seat and walked up the creaky stairs. I unlocked the basement door to the main floor. My dad was sitting over near the front door overlooking the front yard. He was peeking out the blinds when he noticed me. "Boy, what are you doing up here?" he yelled. I need to go to the bathroom. Mom told me to tell you she needs to use the phone." "Okay, just give me a minute, I'll be right back." He got up from his seat and walked toward the basement door. This was my one shot to get out. I ran toward the side door to the house and unbolted the 6 door locks and took the key from my pocket to insert into the keyhole. I turned it, and a stimulating sense of adrenaline shot through my veins as I stepped foot outside into the night. I was running down the street, rotating my head to see both sides of the road, with houses boarded up like some ghost town. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was this piercing tone that pulsates its way through your body. I felt the hairs on my body rise as I keened in on where the sound was coming from. It was in the direction of my school. I wanted to stay hidden, so I took a longer way which took me on the park path. It would take 15 minutes to walk to the school from the way I was taking, and I was 5 minutes away when I had my first encounter with that thing. I heard it snickering, sending a sudden jolt of terror-induced goosebumps. I got low to the ground. I heard it a few hundred yards to the right of me. It was pitch black out, and you could only hear a few crickets here and there. As soon as that thing made a noise, every other creature in the vicinity of it went quiet. It played that high-pitched snicker multiple times until it stopped abruptly. I looked up to see if I could make anything out when I heard something else that caught my attention. I heard someone yelling in the distance. This creature must have heard it before I did, because it went quiet. It took me a few tries to get exactly what the person was saying. It was definitely a male repeating something over and over again. Oh no, it was my father. My father called out to me, "Peter, come home. Peter, come out." He was on the opposite path to the school, which was on the main road a few blocks from my house. There was a little forest in between us currently, but if I get to the school, it wraps around. I also knew if I yelled out, this thing would find me. I got up and started to run. I was only 5 minutes away, and if I ran, I could make it in 3. My plan was to get inside the school, take a shortcut, exit the school, and reconnect with my dad. As the wind rushed past my face while I ran, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was in the field to the right of me, not even 15 feet away. I saw this thing hunched over, just peeking its muscular neck out for me to see its black eyes glisten in the moonlight. That's all I needed to see for my legs to move just a little faster. I could see the school in my view at this point, so I turned back to see if I was being chased. Nothing but the blank pit of darkness which consumed the night. The door was locked from the inside, and I needed a plan B. I looked around, but my hearing is what helped me that night. I heard my dad yell to the right of the building, so I headed that way. Right before I turned the corner to meet my dad, I heard that high-pitched tone that chilled you down to the bone. I felt some evil upon us, and I turned the corner to see my dad staring behind me. I looked at him with confusion, and that's when I sensed something behind me. We all were in the middle of the courtyard, and I asked,
"Dad, I'm scared. What should I do?"
He put his arm out and gestured a down motion for me to get to the ground. I understood this immediately and did what I was told. I got down on all fours and laid on the ground. That's when I heard it.
"This boy is righteously mine. I shall take him back to my home."
Its tongue slithered in a way that lisped its words. It sounded almost like a snake, but humanoid. I was still turned away facing my dad when I saw him reach into his back with both hands. I heard something click when he began to speak.
"You won't take my son, you monster. Go back to hell."
My dad then pulled a pistol out from his back and aimed it at the creature. He didn't think twice about pulling the trigger. All I remember next was hearing that awful screech again, then hearing my dad in agony. He started screaming, and I smelled burnt flesh. I saw this thing attaching itself and burning my father's skin off of his head right in front of me. He looked at me and said one last thing.
"I forgive you."
This monster was morphing into my father, shifting and contorting his muscles, seizing his brain and burning his flesh off. All while it said in that alienatic, emotionless voice,
"Peter's next. Peter's next. Peter's next."
My dad, with what little control he had left of his body, took the pistol and raised it to his mouth, shoved it down his throat, and pulled the trigger. With all of this commotion, the courtyard's lights flickered on, and this creature began to flare up into a flame as the light shined down on it. I saw its veins spurt black liquid out as it died in agony. Its mouth was the last thing to ever move on it, and this sick demon said,
"See you next Halloween, Peter."
This all left me utterly speechless, as it would anyone. I sat there for hours until the police found me in my catatonic state. The reports show that they found me up against a wall that had black liquid smeared all over it, which said, "Free me." I don't remember much of what happened after this, but my mother called the police after neither my father nor I showed up. Nobody believes me when it comes to that night. They locked me up at our local psychological rehabilitation center. They call me a sicko. Trust me, I wouldn't make this stuff up. The damn courts didn't believe me when I told them about that monster that killed my father. I was determined clinically insane with a year of inpatient rehab. I was allowed 1 hour of supervised internet access each day. I used this to my advantage and wrote this for all of you. I hope someone believes me, because this post is my only option I have left. Apparently, the police say they never found my dad's body. All that was found at the crime scene was black sludge and a boy in shock from just witnessing his father's murder. I've made myself pretty comfortable here at the hospital. After the first couple weeks of hearing the often screams coming from the loonies down the hall, you get used to it. I actually made some friends while here. The only thing that makes me want to tear down that door is hearing that sick demon whispering down the hall at night. It only happens every so often, but when it does, I cover my ears with my pillow and hope it's not really there. Sometimes, I'll be sitting eating that disgusting lunch they give us. And upon all the chattering, I hear it. It comes from the vents sometimes, or just outside the window where you can't see. Sometimes, I even think I see him when I'm really drowsy after all the meds they give us here. He just sits there at the end of my hall, just waiting for me. I was sentenced to a full year the day after Halloween. Today marks the first day of October, which means he'll be back. I have to get out of here, or I'll be killed, just like my father was. Maybe I just should have remained hidden. The next time you see a town barren of Halloween screams, don't be so quick to TP their homes. There may just be a very deadly reason behind it. Until next time, enjoy the screams. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more." Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice." Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but within mine of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven. Ghastly grim and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl, to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Startled at the stillness, broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore, of nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, nevermore. This I said engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining, on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er, she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nepenthe from the memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, On this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore. Is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil. By that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden if, within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked up starting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted. Good evening, my Halloween ghouls, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Please have your tickets ready as we walk by to collect them. Thank you. We all have those neighbors who go a bit too far with their holiday decorations now, don't we? Tonight's tale looks at just how much one of our less festive neighbors can take of our love for Halloween. Written by Kyle Harrison, we now present My Neighbors Take Halloween a Little Too Seriously. Let me start out by saying that I am not a people person. When the pandemic hit North America, it was probably the best damn thing to happen to me. Most of my time is spent online anyway, seeing as how I work in data collection for an auditing company. Let me tell you, that wasn't much fun either, given how crazy 2020 has been. Anyway, none of that has to do with the problem I've been having, but I figure that most people start these types of rants off with a few anecdotal notes, so there you go. In a nutshell, I like to be left alone. This is why when I walked out in early September and saw that my neighbors were already beginning to decorate their house with spooky stuff, like inflatable Frankensteins and ghosts, I was a bit put off. Now, I'll admit that they do this almost every year. They have 4 boys, all in elementary, and of course, they want the holidays to be a big time. So why should 2020 be any different? It's just that their house sits adjacent to mine, so when I walk out, it's the first thing I see every single day. And now, thanks to these over-the-top decorations, I was going to be seeing even more of it. Gradually, each day, they added to the house. A few hanging plastic bats here, some spider webs there. I was doing my best to ignore it, really. And I know exactly how I'm going to sound here, being the Grinch of Halloween to some. So, naturally, I kept it to myself. But That ended a few nights back when I started to hear the wails. They installed large stereo speakers near the attic, I think, because the screams coming from the attic were intense. It sounded like they had literally managed to get a soundbite from a crime scene. Let me tell you, hearing that kind of noise at 3:30 in the morning is a bit alarming. I instinctively dialed 911 and complained. I wasn't going to be up all night simply because they wanted to turn their place into a haunted house. Unfortunately for me, the police said that if it wasn't a serious problem where other neighbors complained, that it wasn't a violation of any noise ordinances in the area. You can't be serious. Just listen to this. How am I supposed to get any sleep? I shouted, holding the phone so they could hear. Maybe that was a bit much, but I was pissed and had every right to be, I think. The operator reminded me that the line was meant for emergencies only and bid me a good night, leaving me frustrated and sleep deprived. I went down to my kitchen, got a bottle of Jack, and drank enough to knock myself out on the couch, trying to time the obnoxious screams. The next day, I had cooled down a little and went over to talk to my neighbor after breakfast. Crossing their front lawn was like going through a minefield, though, thanks to the pop-up ghosts and graves they had placed in their yard. The first few nearly gave me a heart attack as I moved to the door, rapping my knuckles on it to get their attention. No one came. I tried again, but got no response. So I walked around to the garage and tried there. It was open, and I couldn't help but notice that their car was gone, and there was a large pool of fake blood on the concrete floor. I stepped forward and noted that they had a few other decorations lying around, like severed heads and zombie body parts, which I assumed would be placed in the yard. The whole thing smelled of high heaven. I held my nose and went to the door near their laundry room, trying again to get someone's attention, but again, no one came. I sighed deeply and walked across the fake blood and paused to see where the bizarre smell was coming from. There were trash bags laying near the garage door, soaking wet from the recent storm, and I rolled my eyes, realizing it had to be that. Despite the fact that I wasn't feeling very neighborly, I went ahead and took the trash to the street and then went back to my house, wondering if any of my other neighbors would care enough to lodge a complaint. Other than this Halloween nut, the other folks around here are pretty ordinary, but none of them live close enough to really hear the noise. I decided instead that night to try and record it, so that way I could let the authorities listen and prove I was dealing with a nuisance on my block. Back home, I took a shower and got some equipment from downstairs ready to listen. But surprisingly, there were no screams that night, just silence. I stayed up to the wee hours. I sound so old saying that, but it's true. I was thinking maybe they realized I had called and complained about them, so that was why they were quiet. So, I called it a night and decided to try again the next day. It was more of the same, not a peep. In fact, I was starting to notice that not one of my neighbors was coming out of their house. This guy has 4 kids. It's hard not to notice them in the early morning as they scramble to catch the school bus. Especially because the driver of the bus is so courteous, he blasts his horn to get mom's attention for the littlest one to grab a face mask. But now, there was nothing happening. It was that way for nearly a week, and I started to grow worried. At first, I told myself it was because I hadn't gotten much sleep. But then, I started doubting myself. What if the scream I heard hadn't been some kind of faux imitation? It rolled around in my mind like a pair of old dice, trying to figure out what I had heard. What if the wife had been attacked? What if it was a break-in? Then I thought back to the fake blood and my body got stiff thinking of how I had stepped through it. Had I mistakenly walked into a real crime scene? The arms, the severed heads. My paranoia was screaming to me. My God, how could I have been so blind? I grabbed my robe and rushed out in the dead of night to go see, using my smartphone to guide the way across the murky suburb streets. Their house was so quiet now, not even a light on. I started to doubt myself again. Had it always been this quiet? I saw the plastic bats and the pop-up graves, and they seemed like they had been there a lot longer than I remembered. Checking the garage got me nowhere. Now, instead of seeing blood, it was spotless, as though someone had come in and cleaned the entire crime scene. It made me internally shiver as a dramatic scene played out in my mind. Chris, that was the husband's name. Chris was working in the kitchen, trying to get dinner ready because his wife Janice wasn't feeling good. It was a plot he had been brewing up for months, I told myself. He was gradually lacing her food to weaken her. And tonight, he planned to finish the job. The scream I heard must have been when she realized something was off. Maybe Chris had decided that he couldn't wait for her to just die. He wanted it swift. Had I seen him with a pretty young woman around town? Maybe. Yes, I think I had. In that coffee shop near the town square. Was he having an affair? If I was his age and knew his wife couldn't perform in the bedroom, I wouldn't have blamed him. But murder wasn't the answer. All these thoughts scrambled through my brain as I stood there in the garage, taking in what had happened. I needed to get inside and check on the wife. What if he had left evidence? I ran back to my house, my heart racing now as I grabbed a few tools from my own shed. Some of them were missing, but I found what I needed. A crowbar could open my way into their house. I smashed it open in 2 tries and stepped into a dusty, dreary laundry room. Trying to turn on the lights had gotten nowhere. Instead, it was obvious that the family wasn't paying their bills. The house was cold, like a tomb. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as I called out to anyone inside. But it looked like the place was abandoned. I took a step forward when abruptly, a fake axe smashed its way out of the wall and I jumped back. It was just another Halloween prop, but it looked so real, so lifelike. Chris must have just finished placing up more Halloween decorations when he decided to go upstairs and take care of his wife. The boys were in the den playing video games when they heard the screams. I imagined them running up to check on their mom, and then Dad panicked. He must have thought that the games would be loud enough that they wouldn't hear. Or he had hoped that Janice wouldn't put up a fight at all. He had miscalculated, and before he knew it, now he had a massacre on his hands. I walked up the steps, thinking of how he likely had hunted his own children in this house. They must have been so frightened. I could see different places in the wall where they had stopped to catch their breath, or skirts in the rug where they had tried to hide. But their father was consumed with killing now. He was on a mission. Their begging and pleading wouldn't stop him. The little one probably went first, I thought, as I got to the top of the stairs. The severed heads I'd seen in the garage haunted me again as I thought of how he had murdered them. It was beyond repulsive. Upstairs, I saw what looked like a hanging corpse. It was upside down from the rafters, with its head loose as well, and it looked like it was meant to deter visitors from entering the master suite. I ignored the prop and pushed through, desperate to see if I was right about what had transpired. But the room looked empty as well. Other than more Halloween decorations, it was another immaculate example of how Chris had gone so far to cover his tracks. What had he done with the rest of their body parts, though? I thought about the trash I had taken out and felt sick. He must have cut up all their bodies and planned to toss them out. I stood there in a daze, realizing how far he had been willing to go. The poor children turning into shredded cheese just because of his lust for another woman. I couldn't help but to vomit and shudder as I ran to the bathroom. As I heaved and caught my breath over the toilet, I checked for more clues. He had to have used chemicals on Janice's body in the tub, I thought, as I smelled the weird bleach. Dissolving her with acids would have been easy, but how had he gotten access to something like that? Then I thought about my own shed. Had he broken in and taken my tools? Was he trying to frame me for this? I'm not sure why my brain jumped to that, but it instantly made me paranoid, and I swallowed hard. What did I do? I had already contacted the police. Should I file another report? But they hadn't listened the first time, so now it made me feel like I was going to be a troublemaker. What if I was wrong about all of this? I needed more proof, I decided. I moved back to the hallway where the corpse was dangling and got a better look at it. My stomach dropped as it occurred to me that this was no prop. It was Chris. I scrambled to find a way to cut him down, hoping to God that he was still alive. It seemed unlikely. There was no way that anyone could be after a few minutes, let alone days. But still, I did my best to cut him down and tried to resuscitate him. His skin was blue and his body was rigid. I felt sick realizing that he had killed himself after finishing his family. It was the only answer that made sense. Some part of me felt it was deserved, though, if my guess of how events played out was true. There was no way anyone with a conscience could live with themselves after killing their children, I thought. I took my smartphone out and got a few pictures, the proof I would need to show the cops. Then, I made my way out of there. It felt like the house was haunted, now that I knew the reality of what had happened, and I didn't want to spend another hour in there, not even 1 minute. Back home, I tiredly put the final pieces of the puzzle together in my brain. The only part that didn't make sense was Chris's lover. Surely she would have come looking for them. Where was she? I got some shut-eye and tried to not be mortified by the thought that maybe Chris had gone after her too. The next day, I was rudely woken up by the sound of police at my door. I didn't remember calling them, but I let them in anyway. What they told me had me feeling sick. They were there with a warrant to search my premises. One of my neighbors had reported suspicious activity in the area and sounds of screaming. I nearly lost it, angered that they were taking these reports seriously instead of my own. But inwardly, my stomach was twisting and turning. What if Chris had somehow planted evidence against me before he committed suicide? The officers combed the house and brought canine units to sniff every nook and cranny. It didn't take long for them to find the trash bags, the ones I was sure that I had taken to the road, filled with body parts. The shed was next. They found trace evidence that my fingerprints were all over the tools that were used to kill the family. I started to vomit, trying to find words that made sense. Of course my fingerprints would be there. They were my tools, for God's sake. I hardly knew what else to show them, so I insisted to the two officers that they needed to check out Chris's house. That was where the true crime had been committed, after all. They questioned me for what felt like hours. I literally was sure that I was going to the slammer for this perceived crime. It felt like my life was over. I was frightened, shaking like a leaf as I told them what I believed happened. This is just a misunderstanding. I pay my taxes. I donate to the city. These people are the ones that are sick, I stammered. I told them how this had started with the family obsession for Halloween. My mind started to play tricks on me again as I replayed events. What if it had all been one massive stunt? What if none of it were real? I was losing my mind. My world was spinning. Were these even real cops? If so, they were going to toss me in a cell and throw away the key. But if not, panicked as they kept writing their report, told them I needed to use the bathroom. I went to vomit and to think. There wasn't going to be a way out of this if this was for real. All the evidence pointed toward me. My palms were sweaty, and I started to convulse. There had to be a way out. I slammed my fist against the glass, causing shards to break in my hand. My fist was bloody now, but my hand was no longer shaking. In that moment, a new version of events played out in my head, one where I was the culprit. I'm not a people person. I hate my neighbors. Their decorations keep me up at all hours of the night, Halloween and Christmas. This year, I had hoped that the pandemic would stop them, but it seemed to spur them on even further. Had I gone over there to confront them, got into a heated argument, and killed them all? No, it couldn't be. I didn't remember doing that. My reflection showed a twisted and dark smile, and it sent shivers down my spine. What was happening to me? I slammed at the glass again, trying to make it break entirely. The police managed to break the bathroom door down and pulled me away. The rest of the evening was a bit of a blur. They gave me something to calm my nerves and started talking about the event, the reality of what had really happened over the past few days. My neighbors have been dead for a year now, they said. And another neighbor, down the street, had grown concerned for my well-being when it seemed that I had checked on them more frequently. As though I thought they were still alive. They had no evidence to hold me because the trash bags that had body parts didn't seem to hold any fingerprints. So it could have easily been someone else that had dropped them there. They had been sitting in my shed, sliced up and mutilated for a year now. They said the crime was still an ongoing investigation, and since they didn't have a warrant, they just had to bid me a good night, having finished with their wellness check. And I stared out toward the neighbor's house. It was abandoned, a crime scene from a year ago on Halloween, when I had grown tired of their screams and antics. And as I stared at their decorations, I saw their ghosts standing on the front lawn, glaring at me, pointing at me for their deaths. I know now how this Halloween will play out, because even though I didn't anticipate this nightmare, now I've become a part of their celebration. One can only hope this man doesn't live next door to them, as he would certainly take issue with the sprawling Halloween amusement park in my front yard. My goal is to shame my less festive neighbors into decorating their own homes for Halloween. Until next time, don't stop decorating.
Tickets? Tickets, please. Tickets? Right this way, friends. Welcome to the show. Tonight, we present 4 fun-sized tales to trick-or-treat by. In the first tent, we have a bit of cosmic horror as we present There Was Something Wicked About the Fog of '87.
During the fall of 1987, a strange fog rolled into my small Midwestern town, population 10,000. At the time, I lived in a small town where everybody practically knew each other, which was one of the reasons why I loved it there. Anyway, it was my junior year of high school, and Halloween was just 1 week away, which I was excited about because Halloween was my favorite holiday. Every yard in the neighborhood was littered with those cheesy Halloween decorations you'd find at your local discount store. Anyway, where was I? Oh, it was Friday night when the fog first rolled into my town. I was doing my homework when all of a sudden I heard Miss Jones from down the street let out a blood-curdling scream. I quickly jumped out of my chair and peered out the window. That's when I noticed my whole street was now enveloped in this thick blanket of fog, like in the movie The Mist. There was something different about the way this fog moved, almost snake-like. Anyway, I stepped onto my porch and noticed the whole neighborhood was now outside too. I could hear whispers of awe as everybody began watching the fog. Soon, more blood-curdling screams could be heard as something inside the fog began snatching up my neighbors. One by one, I could hear their screams. The rest of us ran inside our homes, where we would all remain until Monday morning. After I was safely back inside my house, I locked all of the doors, then hid inside a closet. My parents were gone for the week, so I was all alone, and you can imagine just how scared I was. When I finally emerged from the closet, it was already 2 a.m, and I was exhausted. Needless to say, I didn't get any sleep for the rest of the day. When Sunday morning arrived, I was finally able to get some sleep despite the strange fog still lingering outside. At around 11 at night, though, I awoke to a strange sound I could not explain. Still half asleep, I slowly got out of bed and noticed the fog had somehow made its way inside my house. I screamed, but was immediately silenced as a tendril from within the fog shot out, wrapping itself around my neck and causing a cold, searing pain like no other. Although I struggled to breathe, I somehow managed to free myself. I tried calling my parents, but my phone was dead. I grabbed my car keys and tried to make my way toward the door, but instead was slammed hard against the wall. I cried out in pain as the fog moved quickly toward me, I was trapped. Before I could react, the sirens located around my town began going off, causing the fog to retreat. When Monday arrived, my street looked like a total bloodbath with bodies scattered everywhere, easily mistaking them for Halloween decorations. In total, 100 people were killed during that fateful weekend. Nobody could ever explain why the strange fog rolled into town that year, but they did have their theories, even going as far as blaming the local power plant. Now, I have my own theories, and maybe, just maybe, it was radiation from the power plant. Anyway, people began moving out until eventually only 60 people remained, including my parents. Over the years, you'd hear about the occasional urban explorer or a homeless person going missing after visiting the nearly abandoned town. After I graduated from high school, I moved far away and had not been back for 33 years. But today, I received the news that the fog has returned. Now, I am finally going home.
Friends, please do try to avoid the fog as you exit our first tent. Right this way. In our second tent of the night, we examine a mysterious trick-or-treater in Trick or Treat, Don't Look Under the Sheet.
The same boy has been coming to my house every Halloween for 4 years. He wears the same ridiculous costume every year. A ratty, blank, off-white tablecloth that hangs much too low on his body, scraping the dirt, with poorly scribbled, hollow black circles for eyes. The appearance isn't quite memorable by itself, only in the quality and character of the way it moved. I saw him, every year, come across the lawn just as the sun set behind the hill, bathing our house in an ominous violet shadow, moving toward me, but never seeming to demonstrate any actual steps forward. It was a bizarre, inhuman sensation, one that I never quite grew accustomed to, moving but unmoving, crossing ground like he was being pulled along by a string. There was something else too. Something I noticed on our first meeting 4 years ago, when I held out our plastic Rite Aid jack-o'-lantern bucket and watched as the sheet came forward where a hand should have been, removed a portion of the treats, and buried them under that drab cloth. He smelled. It was a unique stench, wet mud and spoiled milk, raw meat left on a counter, putrid, nauseating, indescribable mostly, except that I never forgot it. It was there, always there, when that boy visited each Halloween. It lingered too, for hours, even after he left, like it poisoned the very air around him. It was always the same, every time, every Halloween, except for last year. I haven't been able to tell anyone, not until today, not even my wife. She doesn't care much about Halloween. She doesn't like to see the kids anymore. Not since our son died. She stays downstairs until it's over. I don't think she knows about any of it. Last year, curiosity got the better of me. I did something I shouldn't have. I was ready for the boy that day. I waited. I watched. I knew when he would arrive, the perilous, rolling black dusk where the world seemed to stop and anything was possible. He came just as he always did, just as a dead chill came down from the hill and shrieked against our house. He crossed the yard, motionless, as he always was, his tattered cloth unmoving. I opened the front door and smiled, happy to see my silent friend, wildly anxious to finally discover what could have possibly been beneath that strange fabric all of these years. I thrust the bucket in front of me like some sort of offering. When it moved, I moved, faster. I grabbed the sheet right at the crown of the head and pulled down, wrenching it free in a violent swirl. She didn't move. She didn't try to hide. It was my wife, wearing my dead son's clothes, wearing my dead son's skin. Her face was blank except the worms, dozens of them, pale, greedily snaking through his horribly decayed cheeks and forehead. She didn't seem to recognize me or didn't seem to care. I stood, paralyzed, watching as she took the candy, replaced the sheet, and left. I haven't told my wife about any of it, and I hope she doesn't read this. I don't think she knows.
Very, very sad indeed, friends. We hope the poor woman can find a better way to live with her son's memory. Please continue to tent number 3. If you know anyone who favors Christmas heavily over Halloween, you may want to introduce them to our next tale, titled Wait Until After Halloween.
I've been a resident of my neighborhood for over 2 years now. While I've managed to become accustomed to it, I had a particularly rocky start with it. In particular, the unofficial rule in this neighborhood to never have Christmas decorations up before Halloween was over. I did just that. People warned me about it, saying that if I didn't take them down, I'd be sorry. I replied to them that if me doing so didn't result in a fine, I'd do whatever I want with my own property. I should have listened to them. It was the 20th when it came. I had just gotten through setting up the lights. I wasn't a big Halloween fan, to say the least. I always preferred Christmas. In that regard, I'd always put my decorations up in late October. Sure, I'd get some eye rolls from people passing by. However, nothing really bad would happen to me, not until that night. I stepped back, taking a moment to admire my handiwork. That was when I heard it. Up in the night sky, I saw a silhouette barely illuminated by the moon and stars. Its appearance was some twisted combination of bat and deer. The most prominent thing about it was its fiery red eyes and its nose, which also seemed to burn like a flame. I was speechless upon seeing it. Tried to rationalize it in my mind, thinking it was in fact a large bat, and that my mind was playing tricks on me. It coming into full view proved me wrong. My Christmas lights illuminated it fully. It was certainly more deer-like in appearance, if deer had razor-sharp teeth. Its claws were so sharp-looking, I thought, if it wanted to, it could cut me in half with one swipe. I didn't know what to do in that situation. It was blocking the way to my house, and I doubted I could outrun it with how fast it was. I shouted for help, only to glance over and see my neighbors turn out their lights. I mentally cursed them and turned back to the creature. I had no idea at the time why it was in front of me. What I did know was that I needed to find a way to escape it. As it approached me and raised one of its hands, presumably to strike at me, I thought fast and kicked off one of my shoes at its head to distract it. Then attempted mad dashing toward my front door. I got maybe 8 feet before I felt it yank me back and throw me to the ground. I groaned in pain and tried sitting up. In addition to it sounding really pissed off at me as indicated by the fact that it was growling, my shoe was hanging from one of its antlers. It grabbed the shoe and threw it at me with such force that my nose broke. Defenseless and groggy from the pain, with blood running down my shirt, all I could do was watch it. To my confusion and surprise, it yanked free one of my plastic candy canes. These feelings quickly turned into fear when I realized what it planned on doing with it. I tried to plead with it, but it was no use. All I could do was raise my arms in a feeble attempt to shield myself as it brought the candy cane down on me repeatedly. Getting hit by one being swung by a regular person is painful enough, never mind when whatever that thing was is wielding them. The force of its swing was so strong it broke my right arm, which is my dominant one. One candy cane beating was bad. Unfortunately for me, it decided to make use of all the ones I owned. By the time it was done, they were all in pieces, and I was a broken mess on the ground. My vision was blurry from the pain. Although I could make out that it was flying toward my house and cutting down the attached lights. When it landed in front of me, I thought it was going to deliver the killing blow. Instead, it did something I wasn't expecting. It spoke. The only response I could give to it was a pained croak. Its voice was deep and raspy.
Next year, wait until after Halloween.
It then pointed from me to my Santa lawn decoration, which it decapitated with one slice of its claws. I passed out shortly after that. When I woke up the next day, the neighbors gave me smug looks as I passed by. The hospital trip was a pain. What was even worse was having to clean up the mess it left behind. Trying to find bits of broken glass and plastic while wearing a cast was not easy. I figured whatever that thing was, it was really into Halloween. Not wanting to re-incur its wrath, I made sure to get some last-minute decorations for the holiday in order to appease it. As the trick-or-treaters walked by on Halloween, I could see it watching me from the woods. Only the lights of its eyes and nose were visible. Children and parents who also noticed it walked quickly by it. They reacted to it as if it was something they were used to. I figured that this was the case, and now I am too. Every October it can be spotted watching from the woods for anyone to break the neighborhood's unofficial rule. I make sure to follow this to a T and even put up Halloween decorations early. As a result of my experience, I have found an appreciation for the holiday. I just make sure I never put up any Christmas decorations until November. I don't know what that thing is or where it came from. All I know is that I don't ever want to get on its bad side again. If you happen to be as big a Christmas fan as I am and move to my neighborhood, I suggest you heed my warning, or it will come for you.
I thought you might appreciate the comic relief. Although we do hope that our new fan of Halloween has recovered properly. The time has come. We must now approach our final tent of the evening. But I must offer an apology up front, as this one is the trick. Why? Because we lied to you. This is not a fun-sized tale, but a slightly longer piece about what might happen with the real ghouls when our trick-or-treaters are no longer allowed to walk among them on Halloween night. For our final tale of the evening, we present No One Told the Monsters Halloween Isn't Happening.
It's a full moon on a Saturday, for crying out loud.
My brother Alex shouted over his spooky Halloween mix. His head periodically popped out of the plywood abomination covering his lawn like a human whack-a-mole.
There's no way I'm gonna miss it.
I sighed and zipped up my jacket. Even during the day, the early October wind was biting.
Don't you think it's a bit much?
I asked.
No one is trick-or-treating this year.
I won't be outdone. The Hendersons are into it.
His hand whipped out of the maze and pointed aggressively to the yard across the street. The neighbor's intimidating display consisted of a single orange bag of leaves with a jack-o'-lantern face on the front. Every year, Alex adds new pieces to his already elaborate Halloween decorations. That creature had now evolved into his short maze, starting on the sidewalk and ostensibly ending at the front door. My sister-in-law gives out the candy, and Alex operates a new jump scare from somewhere within. I think this year he was a giant trapdoor spider or something. He even built a chicken door halfway through in case kids need to bail. My brother has many interesting feelings about the holiday. One of which is that candy should be earned, and that the more of it he keeps for himself, the more he has won. I love him anyway. I felt a tug on my hand.
Can I go in yet, Dad?
Lily asked. I told her to hang on until Uncle Alex gave the all clear. He was still tearing through the maze, turning props around and throwing blankets over the grislier scenes. If he wanted to use my 5-year-old as a test subject, he'd have to tone it down to the before 7 o'clock setting. Maybe he really thought he'd learn something from a test run, but I think he was just excited to share his passion with someone else. Lily hopped around in excitement. The cardboard discs sandwiching her threatened to fall apart with every jump. We had sat down one night and Googled costume ideas, but her mind was made up from the get-go. She insisted on being a button. Whatever, it was super easy, and her costume was already done a month ahead of the date. Celebratory sounds grew louder as my brother emerged from the entrance.
Okay, kiddo, are you ready?
Alex asked in a loopy ghost voice. Lily nodded and bolted forward.
Whoa, whoa, whoa,
Alex called.
It's dangerous to go alone.
He grinned at me as he untied a line of string. Out on the verge, a dummy that Alex had intended to be a clown was propped up in a lawn chair. He made it from his clothes stuffed with more clothes and then threw a clown wig on it. I assumed he'd refine it before the big day. Right then, it was just a lump of laundry sporting a polka dot shirt and a wig. A single foil balloon was tied to the arm of the chair. Alex handed it to Lily, giving her this whole speech about how the balloon would keep her safe and how important it was to hang on to it. I like this new touch. I think a lot of parents would get anxious sending their kids onto a stranger's property where they can't see them. The balloons keep track of where everyone is and help to assuage those fears. Though, I wonder if he considered who's supposed to give the balloons out. Alex told Lily to count to 30 and made for his hiding spot. I helped her count all the way to 30, and then she took off into the maze. I watched her balloon bob around. It would speed up abruptly or slowly round corners. I heard a growl from a low-quality speaker ring out above the ambient Halloween music, followed by a little yelp from Lily. The balloon retreated and stopped. I could picture her gathering her courage. Sure enough, the balloon started making progress again. I stood on the sidewalk smiling to myself and shuffled my feet to stay warm. I was shocked to attention when I suddenly sensed movement nearby. I took a step back as 3 figures shambled past me without a word. I'd been idly glancing around in boredom that entire time and hadn't seen them approach. The only car parked on the street was mine. I caught their profiles as they went. The person in the lead took great, loping steps, throwing the weight of their bulky costume ahead of them. Their torso was conversely thin with saggy skin. Thin hairs popped out of the top of their pale head. The middle one almost seemed to glide forward. Theirs was the least intricate costume, as they simply looked like someone hunched over in a burlap sack. I thought they must be on wheels somehow. Trailing the trio was someone who looked to be attending a masquerade. I caught a flash of black contacts in the peripheral of their mask. They paid me absolutely no mind, like I wasn't even there. Must be friends of Alex's, I settled on. If anyone knew people who get that into Halloween so early, it was my brother. I was going to make a joke about needing more balloons, but they had already rounded the first corner of the maze. Lily's balloon was more than halfway through when I heard that growl again. tripped by the strangers. They must have been moving really fast, not exactly allowing time to stop and smell the corpses. Lily's balloon hit a straightaway near the end when I heard a startled squeak from her. The cry cut off abruptly, and the balloon wavered like a fishing bobber. It went end to end of that longer corridor, as if Lily was sprinting back and forth. It came to a halt and then just floated away. Lily had let go. I watched the balloon drift into the sky, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. The tense music from that stupid Halloween CD lent an air of ridiculousness to how I was feeling. "Lily," I called out, trying to keep the concern from my voice. No response from anyone. "Lily," I yelled into the first 5 feet of the maze. I heard wood scraping on wood off to my right. I ran to the edge of the maze and saw those 3 adult trick-or-treaters exiting through the chicken door. I expected them to say something, either to me or each other, but they quietly made for the sidewalk. "Hey," I shouted. The tall, pale one with the weird body stopped and turned to look at me. Their tiny yellow eyes narrowed even further in confusion. "Yeah, you," I continued. "Who are you people?" The tall one looked around, its too wide mouth drawn at a grimace. The other 2 stopped on the sidewalk and waited for their companion. My eyes couldn't even focus on the one in the rough cloak. The tall one's gaze finally fell on the clown dummy behind me. It replaced the thin hairs on its head with bright red tufts sprouting from its scalp. Multicolored splotches broke out all over their body. With a look of satisfaction, it backed away again. "What the hell?" I started. Noticing I was still upset with it, contentment gave to rage as its massive mouth flashed into a snarl bearing countless grimy teeth. It roared and wobbled toward me. I fell back onto the grass and scrambled for the maze. Self-preservation screamed in tandem with concern for my daughter. In a terrified frenzy, I rammed into the flimsy plywood walls. I kept shouting Lily's name until everything was leveled. The world and I spun as I pored over the ruined decorations. It was impossible. Lily went in, and I would have seen her come out. She had to be there. By the time I felt Alex shaking me back to my senses, the trio was gone. I collapsed when I found half of her button costume, the cardboard all mangled and torn. My mind reeling as to the origin of the tiny red flecks peppering the crumpled costume. Before the police put curtains up, some neighbors came around to take pictures and tried to congratulate Alex on outdoing himself with the crime scene. We're still being questioned on Lily's disappearance, and apparently, I'm being treated with a great deal of suspicion. The investigators are at least humoring bringing those trick-or-treaters in for questioning. Alex maintains he has no idea who they were and says he never even saw them. The only theory I dare to hold is those 3 kidnapped Lily and concealed her as they escaped. And the transformation that thing went through. The way it seemed like a nocturnal predator caught in the light of day. That feeling I got, that I shouldn't be able to look at them. I think it all comes back to our early Halloween activities. Halloween started for a reason, and I think we enjoyed the protection our numbers provided. Similarly, I think they enjoyed the camouflage. I can only imagine the calamity when none of that happens this year.
Let this be a lesson to those who wish to cancel trick-or-treating. The consequence of doing so may be far beyond any benefit that you believe you may enjoy. And that wraps up our presentation for the evening, friends. Thank you so much for coming out. We hope you've enjoyed the show and look forward to seeing you again next time. Remember to monster mash the subscribe button and click the little Franken chime next to it to ensure that you will be alerted by the elder YouTube gods when we present our next set of lovely tales to trick or treat by. Until next time, sweet frightmares.